The billionaire laughed when he called the waitress stupid. 20 minutes later, that single word would become the most expensive mistake of his life. The Grand Monarch Hotel in downtown Chicago glittered beneath crystal chandeliers and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. Luxury cars lined the entrance. Reporters waited outside behind velvet ropes. Inside the private ballroom, some of the most influential investors in America gathered around a polished conference table where a deal worth $3.5 billion was expected to be finalized before the night ended. At the center of attention sat Richard Harrison. At 47 years old, he was one of the most recognizable CEOs in the country. Financial magazines praised his aggressive leadership style. Business channels followed his every move. Tonight, Richard looked completely at ease. Wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit and an expensive watch that caught the light whenever he moved his hand, he spoke confidently with investors and advisors while discussing expansion plans that could reshape entire markets. Around him, people listened carefully. Few individuals in the room possessed the power he did. Moving quietly through the ballroom was Jasmine Brooks. At 28 years old, she wore a professional waitress uniform with a neatly pressed black apron. Her posture was calm. Her movements were precise. She carried trays, served drinks, and remained nearly invisible to the wealthy guests around her. Most people never looked at her twice. Jasmine had learned long ago that people often noticed uniforms before they noticed human beings. It no longer surprised her. As dinner progressed, stacks of documents were distributed across the table. Lawyers reviewed contracts. Investors examined projections. Advisors discussed timelines. The atmosphere felt optimistic. Everyone expected success. Richard certainly did. He spoke with the confidence of a man who believed the evening was already won. As Jasmine delivered coffee to one side of the table, she noticed a folder resting near Richard's seat. One page had slipped slightly out of place, exposing part of a financial summary. She was not trying to read it, but a number immediately caught her attention. Her eyes narrowed for a brief moment. Something looked unusual. Very unusual. Jasmine hesitated. Then, believing she might be helping, she approached carefully. "Excuse me, sir," she said politely. "I think there may be a page missing from that section." Several heads turned. Richard glanced down at the documents before looking back at her. The room became quiet. For a second, Jasmine wondered if she had interrupted at a bad moment. Then Richard laughed. It was not a friendly laugh. It was the kind of laugh people used when they wanted others to join them. "A page missing," he said loudly. Several guests looked toward Jasmine. Richard leaned back in his chair and shook his head. "That is adorable. We have lawyers, analysts, and consultants reviewing this deal. I do not think we need financial advice from a waitress." A few uncomfortable smiles appeared around the room. Jasmine remained silent. Richard continued. "Just bring the coffee, sweetheart. Leave the thinking to people who understand what they are looking at." Then he added the word that immediately changed the atmosphere. "Stupid." Silence spread across the ballroom. A few guests lowered their eyes. Others looked away entirely. The insult hung in the air far longer than Richard realized. Jasmine felt every face in the room watching her. Yet she did not argue. She did not defend herself. She simply nodded once and stepped back. "Of course, sir," she said quietly. Then she returned to her work. The dinner resumed, but something had changed. Several investors exchanged uncomfortable glances. One older guest frowned slightly. Richard, however, seemed completely unaffected. He returned to discussing the agreement, convinced the evening remained firmly under his control. Across the room, Jasmine continued serving guests with the same calm professionalism as before. Yet hidden behind her quiet expression was a thought she could not ignore. Because the page Richard had dismissed was connected to something far more important than anyone at that table realized. The ballroom slowly returned to conversation, but the mood never fully recovered from what had happened. Richard Harrison appeared unconcerned. He laughed with investors, discussed market forecasts, and continued presenting the future of the deal as if nothing unusual had occurred. Around him, advisors nodded confidently, while servers moved between tables carrying coffee and dessert. Yet several guests kept glancing toward Jasmine Brooks. They could not forget the way she had handled the insult. Most people would have reacted with anger or embarrassment. Jasmine had done neither. She simply continued working. That quiet dignity lingered in people's minds long after the conversation moved on. Jasmine collected empty glasses near the back of the room while trying to focus on her responsibilities. She had no interest in creating conflict. However, the document she had briefly seen continued bothering her. The number she noticed was connected to a projected liability figure buried within a financial summary. She had only seen part of the page, but something about it looked familiar. Uncomfortably familiar. Years earlier, before her life changed direction, Jasmine had spent countless hours reviewing similar reports. Numbers had once been her world. Financial models, risk assessments, market projections. She had studied them relentlessly. Even now, despite years away from that environment, certain patterns still jumped out at her immediately. Across the room, the discussion shifted toward final approval conditions. Representatives from an international investment group reviewed several contract provisions while Richard confidently answered questions. The atmosphere appeared positive on the surface. Yet Jasmine noticed subtle signs of concern among some investors. A few pages were being reviewed repeatedly. Certain questions were asked more than once. One executive quietly requested clarification regarding projected exposure in a particular scenario. Richard's legal team provided an answer, and the conversation moved forward. But Jasmine saw uncertainty remain on the investor's face. As she refilled water glasses, fragments of discussion reached her ears. The numbers being mentioned aligned with the concern she had noticed earlier. Her pulse quickened. The more she listened, the more convinced she became that the issue was real. It was not a missing page. It was a misplaced assumption buried inside the financial structure of the agreement. If the assumption proved incorrect, projected earnings could be significantly overstated. Worse, sophisticated investors would eventually discover it themselves. Jasmine stopped near a service station and closed her eyes briefly. Part of her wanted to forget everything. Richard had made it very clear that her opinion was not welcome. He had humiliated her in front of an entire room. Why should she risk further embarrassment trying to help someone who clearly had no respect for her? Yet another part of her could not ignore the growing concern. The mistake was sitting in plain sight. Every minute that passed brought the deal closer to completion. Near the center of the ballroom, Richard stood beside a large display screen reviewing final projections. His confidence filled the room. Investors listened carefully. Reporters waiting outside were already preparing headlines about the massive agreement. Success felt inevitable. Jasmine watched the presentation and felt a knot forming in her stomach. The numbers looked impressive, but they were built on the same foundation that troubled her earlier. Suddenly, a voice behind her interrupted her thoughts. An older investor who had witnessed the earlier insult looked at her thoughtfully. He lowered his voice. "You seemed concerned about something before," he said. Jasmine hesitated. "It is probably nothing," she replied politely. The investor studied her expression for a moment. "That is not what your face is saying." Jasmine glanced toward the conference table where the future of a $3.5 billion deal was being decided. Then she looked back at the investor. For the first time that evening, someone appeared willing to listen. And deep down, she knew the clock was running out. The older investor's question lingered between them. Around the ballroom, conversations continued, glasses clinked softly, and expensive suits moved between tables beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers. Yet for Jasmine Brooks, everything else seemed to fade into the background. She glanced once more toward the conference table where Richard Harrison stood confidently discussing future growth projections. The deal was moving quickly now, faster than before. Final documents were being reviewed. Advisors were preparing closing summaries. If there was ever a moment to speak, it was disappearing by the second. Jasmine lowered her voice. "I only saw part of a page," she said carefully. "So I could be wrong." The investor nodded. "Go on." Jasmine hesitated. Years had passed since she had spoken about financial analysis with anyone. Most people she met only knew her as a waitress. They saw the uniform. They saw the apron. They never asked what came before. "There appears to be a risk calculation built around an assumption that may not hold under changing market conditions," she said quietly. The investor's expression changed immediately. "What assumption?" Jasmine explained what little she had seen. As she spoke, the investor's eyes narrowed. He stopped smiling. Then he asked a follow-up question. Jasmine answered. Then another. Jasmine answered again. The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes. Yet by the end of it, the investor looked deeply concerned. "How do you know this?" he asked. Jasmine looked down briefly. "I used to work with financial models." It was technically true. The investor studied her face for a moment. He could tell there was far more to the story than she was revealing. Before he could ask another question, one of Richard's advisors called him back toward the conference table. The investor thanked Jasmine and walked away. Jasmine immediately regretted saying anything at all. She returned to the service station and tried to focus on her duties. Yet something unexpected happened. Less than 10 minutes later, she noticed the same investor speaking quietly with two others. Soon, all three were reviewing a section of the agreement together. Their expressions became increasingly serious. Across the room, Richard continued presenting. He appeared completely unaware of the shift taking place among several key decision-makers. The atmosphere remained positive on the surface, but beneath it, questions were beginning to spread. One investor requested clarification regarding future liability exposure. Another asked about assumptions tied to international market volatility. A third questioned projected revenue stability under alternative scenarios. Richard's legal team provided answers. His analysts supplied charts. Yet each answer seemed to generate another question. Jasmine watched carefully. The concern she had felt earlier was no longer hers alone. Several experienced investors were now looking at the same area of the agreement. For the first time that evening, Richard looked slightly irritated. He was accustomed to controlling rooms like this. He was accustomed to confidence. Uncertainty was something he preferred to eliminate quickly. "We have reviewed these projections extensively," Richard said. "The numbers have been validated by some of the best consultants in the industry." The statement sounded strong, yet it did not end the discussion. In fact, it seemed to intensify it. Investors continued reviewing documents. Advisors whispered among themselves. A few guests who previously looked relaxed now appeared uneasy. Jasmine felt her pulse quicken. She knew exactly what was happening. Once experienced investors noticed a possible weakness, they would keep digging until they found the answer. That was their job. Near the front of the room, Richard's confidence remained intact. But the foundation beneath that confidence was beginning to crack. The most remarkable part was that nobody knew where the questions had originated. Nobody knew that the first warning had come from the waitress carrying coffee. And as another round of document reviews began, Jasmine realized something that made her stomach tighten. The deeper they looked, the closer they were getting to the mistake she had noticed almost immediately. Questions multiplied across the ballroom like cracks spreading beneath polished glass. What had started as a routine review was becoming something far more uncomfortable. Investors who had arrived expecting a celebration were now rereading sections of the agreement with growing concern. Advisors whispered behind stacks of documents. Attorneys requested additional verification. The atmosphere remained professional, but confidence was no longer automatic. Richard Harrison noticed the shift immediately. Years of leading negotiations had taught him how to read a room. The problem was that he could not yet identify the source. Standing near the presentation screen, he answered another series of questions regarding projected revenue assumptions. His voice remained steady. His posture remained confident. Yet each response seemed to create more discussion instead of less. Across the table, several members of the investment group exchanged increasingly serious looks. One executive highlighted multiple passages inside the financial summary. Another began comparing figures from separate reports. The deeper they looked, the more attention focused on the same section that had caught Jasmine Brooks's eye earlier in the evening. Near the service station, Jasmine continued performing her duties. She refilled water glasses, collected empty plates, delivered fresh coffee. Outwardly, nothing about her behavior suggested concern. Inside, however, she felt a growing sense of urgency. She knew exactly where the discussion was heading. The troubling assumption hidden inside the financial model was beginning to attract attention from people experienced enough to recognize the warning signs. What worried her most was how long it was taking them to connect the pieces. Every minute increased the risk that decisions would be made before the truth became fully understood. An attorney requested a short pause so several figures could be verified. The room agreed. Investors gathered in small groups while analysts reviewed spreadsheets on laptops. Richard remained calm, but irritation was becoming visible around the edges of his confidence. He was accustomed to controlling details. Tonight, details seemed determined to resist him. As Jasmine passed one of the tables, she overheard part of a conversation between two senior investors. "If this assumption fails, the projected returns change significantly," one said quietly. "Exactly," the other replied. That is why I want to know who validated it. Jasmine lowered her eyes and continued walking. The questions were finally reaching the heart of the issue. At the center of the ballroom, Richard's chief financial advisor began explaining the methodology behind the projections. Charts appeared on screens. Additional reports were distributed. For a moment, the explanation seemed to satisfy the room. Several investors nodded. A few even relaxed. Jasmine hoped she was wrong. She genuinely hoped the analysis would hold up under scrutiny. Then a new question changed everything. One investor pointed to a supporting document and asked why a particular risk adjustment had been calculated using outdated market conditions instead of current data. Silence followed. The advisor blinked. He looked down at the report. Then he looked toward another analyst. The analyst checked several pages before responding. The answer lacked certainty. Investors immediately noticed. Richard noticed too. The atmosphere tightened once again. Another question followed. Then another. Each one focused on the same area. Each one revealed a little more weakness beneath the surface. Jasmine felt her stomach tighten. The issue was no longer hidden. It was emerging in front of everyone. Yet nobody knew how serious it might become. Richard attempted to redirect the discussion toward long-term opportunities, but investors remained focused on the numbers. They wanted clarity before commitment. They wanted certainty before signatures. And for the first time all evening, Richard Harrison looked less like a man in complete control and more like a man searching for answers. From across the room, Jasmine watched the growing concern spread through the negotiation. She had tried to help once and had been dismissed. Now the same warning was revealing itself to everyone. The difference was that this time, nobody could ignore it. The ballroom had become a room full of careful faces and cautious voices. Nobody was celebrating anymore. The excitement that had filled the Grand Monarch Hotel earlier in the evening had been replaced by something much more dangerous. Doubt. Investors continued reviewing documents while analysts exchanged increasingly concerned looks. Every answer seemed to create another question. Every explanation uncovered another detail that demanded clarification. At the center of it all stood Richard Harrison. He remained composed, but the effortless confidence that had defined him earlier was beginning to fade. He could feel control slipping away, even if he refused to admit it. Jasmine Brooks watched from the edge of the room as she organized fresh coffee service. She wished none of this was happening. Contrary to what some people might assume, she took no satisfaction in Richard's growing discomfort. The insult still stung, but that was not what troubled her. What troubled her was the realization that the problem was larger than anyone in the room understood. The investors were finding symptoms. They still had not discovered the source. Near one of the conference tables, the older investor who had spoken with Jasmine earlier approached her again. His expression was far more serious now. You knew they would find something, he said quietly. Jasmine lowered her eyes. I suspected they might. How? Jasmine hesitated. She glanced around to ensure nobody was listening. Because the issue is not in the calculations themselves, she replied. It is in the assumption beneath them. The investor remained silent, waiting for her to continue. Jasmine took a slow breath. The model assumes a level of future market stability that no longer exists. The projections work if those conditions remain unchanged. But current indicators suggest they will not. The investor stared at her. You are talking about risk exposure. Jasmine nodded. Yes. How do you know this? Once again, Jasmine avoided the full answer. I spent a long time studying these kinds of reports. The investor looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. Before he could ask another question, a call came from the conference table requesting his presence. He thanked Jasmine and walked away. This time, however, he carried something with him. Conviction. Moments later, he raised a new concern during the discussion. Unlike previous questions, this one struck directly at the foundation of the projections. The room immediately became quieter. Analysts opened spreadsheets. Attorneys reviewed supporting documents. Several investors leaned forward. Richard listened carefully as the issue was explained. For the first time all evening, he stopped interrupting. He stopped redirecting. He simply listened. The deeper the review went, the more uncomfortable the findings became. What initially appeared to be a minor assumption was connected to multiple forecasts throughout the agreement. Change one variable, and several projected outcomes changed dramatically. The implications spread across the room like a slow-moving storm. Richard's advisors began working urgently through reports. Their confidence weakened with every new calculation. Across the ballroom, Jasmine felt her stomach tighten. The situation was moving exactly where she feared it would. Yet she remained silent. She had already tried once to help. The memory of Richard's laughter remained fresh. His dismissal had been public, humiliating. More importantly, it had made one thing very clear. He would never willingly listen to her. Near the front of the room, concern was becoming visible on investor faces. Several individuals who had been prepared to sign documents now appeared hesitant. Questions were no longer theoretical. They were becoming financial realities. Richard Harrison stood surrounded by experts, advisors, lawyers, and analysts. Yet the one person who truly understood the problem remained unnoticed near the coffee station. And as the final review entered its most critical stage, Jasmine realized the deal was approaching a point where even the truth might arrive too late. The ballroom felt smaller with every passing minute. Not because the room itself had changed, but because uncertainty was consuming the space that confidence had occupied only an hour earlier. Investors who had arrived expecting signatures were now buried in reports. Attorneys reviewed contract language line by line. Analysts recalculated projections that had seemed unquestionable earlier in the evening. The deal was still alive, but only barely. At the center of the growing storm stood Richard Harrison. His expression remained controlled, yet the signs of pressure were becoming impossible to hide. Questions continued arriving from every direction. Some focused on risk exposure. Others challenged assumptions hidden within the financial model. Each answer provided by his team was met with another request for clarification. The momentum that once pushed the agreement forward had completely disappeared. Across the room, Jasmine Brooks quietly delivered fresh coffee to a conference table. She could feel the tension without hearing a single word. Everyone sensed the same thing. The negotiation had reached a dangerous threshold. One wrong answer could change everything. As she turned to leave, she noticed the older investor studying her from across the room. He looked as though he wanted to say something, but had not yet decided whether he should. Jasmine understood the feeling. She had been fighting the same internal battle all evening. Part of her wanted to walk away. Her shift would eventually end. The deal was not her responsibility. The people involved had chosen not to listen. Why continue carrying a burden that belonged to someone else? Yet another part of her could not ignore what was happening. She knew the mistake. She understood why the projections were vulnerable. Most importantly, she believed the problem could still be explained clearly enough to prevent disaster. The question was whether anyone would allow her to speak. Near the presentation screen, one investor finally asked the question everyone had been circling around for nearly an hour. Who originally validated the market stability assumptions? Silence followed. Several advisors looked toward one another. Richard's chief analyst responded first. He explained the methodology. He referenced historical performance data. He cited expert reviews. Yet even as he spoke, confidence seemed to drain from the room. Investors were no longer evaluating explanations. They were evaluating trust. The distinction mattered. Financial errors could sometimes be corrected. Lost confidence was much harder to recover. Richard recognized this immediately. For the first time all evening, he stopped presenting and started listening. He reviewed the documents himself. He questioned his own team. He searched for reassurance. Instead, he found uncertainty. Around the ballroom, conversations became quieter, more serious. Several investors who had intended to sign before midnight now looked prepared to delay the decision. The possibility of postponement hung over the room like a storm cloud. Jasmine felt her stomach tighten. A delay would be damaging. A collapse would be catastrophic. Yet the outcome seemed to be moving steadily toward one of those possibilities. Then something unexpected happened. The older investor stood from his chair and walked directly toward Richard Harrison. The room watched. Their conversation began quietly. Richard listened. At first his expression showed irritation, then confusion, then surprise. Finally, his eyes moved across the ballroom and stopped on Jasmine. For several seconds he simply stared. Jasmine immediately understood. The investor had told him. Richard's expression hardened. Pride battled with necessity. The memory of his public insult stood between them like a wall. Yet the situation was changing too quickly for pride alone to solve it. Investors were losing confidence. The deal was approaching a point where recovery might become impossible. And for the first time that evening, Richard Harrison was being forced to consider a possibility he had dismissed from the very beginning. The waitress he had mocked might be the only person in the room who truly understood what was wrong. For several long seconds, nobody moved. Richard Harrison stood near the conference table, staring across the ballroom at Jasmine Brooks. The room sensed something important was happening, even if most people did not yet understand what it was. Conversations faded. Advisors stopped whispering. Investors looked between the billionaire CEO and the waitress who had somehow become part of a discussion involving a $3.5 billion agreement. Jasmine felt dozens of eyes settle on her. She immediately wished they would not. Attention had never been something she wanted, especially not this kind of attention. The older investor spoke first. She noticed the problem before any of us did. The statement landed heavily across the room. Several executives looked surprised. Others looked skeptical. Richard's expression remained unreadable. How? One investor asked. The older man glanced toward Jasmine. That is probably a question she should answer herself. Silence followed. Jasmine stood motionless beside the service station. Every instinct told her to remain where she was. Yet another part of her understood that the evening had already moved beyond that possibility. The issue was no longer whether she would be involved. She already was. Slowly, she walked toward the conference table. The distance felt much longer than it actually was. When she arrived, she stopped a respectful distance away. Richard looked at her carefully. Gone was the confidence that had filled his voice earlier. In its place stood uncertainty. You think you understand the problem? He asked. The question was not hostile. It was cautious. Jasmine took a breath. I think I understand part of it. Several investors exchanged curious looks. Richard folded his arms. Then explain it. Jasmine looked around the room before speaking. She chose her words carefully. The issue was complex, but the explanation did not need to be. She described how the projections depended on a market stability assumption that no longer reflected current conditions. She explained how several growth forecasts were built on that foundation. If the assumption weakened, the projections became increasingly unreliable. More importantly, she explained why experienced investors were reacting the way they were. As she spoke, something remarkable happened. Nobody interrupted. Nobody dismissed her. Investors listened. Attorneys listened. Analysts listened. Several people began reviewing documents while she talked. Others nodded slowly as connections formed in their minds. Richard listened most closely of all. Then one analyst opened a spreadsheet and began checking calculations in real time. Another compared supporting reports. Within minutes, the room arrived at the same conclusion Jasmine had reached hours earlier. The assumption was flawed. The projected returns were significantly overstated under current market conditions. A heavy silence settled across the ballroom. One investor leaned back in his chair and slowly exhaled. Another closed a folder without saying a word. Richard stared down at the documents in front of him. The numbers were no longer hypothetical. They were reality. Then came the second surprise of the evening. One investor looked directly at Jasmine. Where did you learn this? Others immediately turned toward her as well. The question hung in the air. Jasmine hesitated. She had spent years avoiding conversations about her past. But there was no avoiding this one. Quietly, she explained that before becoming a waitress, she had worked as a financial analyst. She had spent years evaluating risk models and market forecasts. Several executives looked stunned. One attorney blinked twice as if he had misheard her. Richard's expression changed completely. For the first time all evening, he was seeing Jasmine not as a waitress, but as a professional whose expertise had been hiding in plain sight. Yet the revelation arrived too late to stop what was already beginning to happen. Because as investors reviewed the corrected projections, confidence was disappearing. And confidence, once lost, was often impossible to recover. The silence inside the ballroom felt heavier than any speech that had been delivered that evening. Investors continued studying revised projections, while analysts updated calculations using corrected assumptions. One by one, the numbers appeared on screens and laptops across the room. Nobody liked what they were seeing. The optimistic forecasts that had supported the agreement for months were shrinking. Risk exposure was growing. Expected returns were falling. Most damaging of all, trust in the underlying analysis was beginning to disappear. Richard Harrison remained standing near the conference table, his attention fixed on the revised figures. He barely noticed the conversations happening around him. Hours earlier, he had entered the ballroom expecting a celebration. Now he was watching confidence drain away in real time. Across the room, Jasmine Brooks quietly stepped back toward the service area. She had answered every question honestly. She had explained the problem as clearly as possible. There was nothing more she could do. The decision now belonged to the investors. Several of them continued asking questions, but the tone had changed completely. Earlier, they were searching for reassurance. Now they were searching for reasons to proceed despite the warning signs. The difference was significant. One investor reviewed the updated projections and slowly shook his head. Another closed a folder and folded his hands. A third requested a private discussion with members of the investment group. Within minutes, multiple conversations were taking place simultaneously throughout the ballroom. The atmosphere no longer resembled a successful negotiation. It resembled damage control. Richard's legal team attempted to propose revisions. His analysts offered alternative scenarios. Advisors discussed mitigation strategies. Yet every solution faced the same obstacle. Confidence had already been broken. Near the windows overlooking Chicago's skyline, several key investors gathered together. Their expressions revealed everything. They were no longer debating terms. They were debating participation. Jasmine watched from a distance. She felt no satisfaction, only sadness. The agreement represented years of work for many people. Employees, partners, investors, and executives had all contributed to reaching this point. Nobody wanted to see it fail. Yet reality could not be negotiated. Numbers either worked or they did not. Assumptions were either reliable or they were not. Eventually, the lead representative of the investment group returned to the main table. The room immediately quieted. Richard looked up. So did everyone else. The representative spoke calmly and professionally. He thanked Richard and his team for their efforts. He acknowledged the tremendous potential of the partnership. Then he delivered the decision nobody wanted to hear. The investment group would not be moving forward with the agreement under the current structure. A heavy silence followed. Nobody reacted immediately. Even though many had anticipated the outcome, hearing it spoken aloud felt different. Final. Definitive. $3.5 billion disappeared from the table in a matter of seconds. Richard lowered his eyes toward the documents in front of him. For the first time all evening, he had no response. No presentation. No argument. No strategy. The numbers spoke for themselves. Around the ballroom, guests exchanged stunned looks. Advisors sat quietly. Attorneys closed folders. Months of preparation had ended without a signature. As investors began gathering their materials, one unavoidable truth settled over the room. The warning signs had been present long before the collapse. The problem could have been examined hours earlier. Questions could have been asked sooner. Yet the first person who recognized the danger had been ignored. Richard slowly turned his head toward the service station where Jasmine stood. Their eyes met briefly across the room. In that moment, he finally understood something far more painful than losing a deal. The person he had dismissed as unqualified had understood the situation better than anyone else in the ballroom. For a long time after the decision was announced, nobody seemed eager to leave. The ballroom remained filled with people, yet an unusual quiet had settled over the room. Investors gathered their documents. Attorneys packed briefcases. Advisors exchanged final conversations in lowered voices. Outside the towering windows, Chicago's skyline glittered beneath the night sky exactly as it had hours earlier. Yet inside the Grand Monarch Hotel, everything had changed. Richard Harrison remained standing near the conference table long after most discussions had ended. The folders in front of him represented months of planning, negotiations, projections, and expectations. Now they represented something else. A lesson. One he would not soon forget. Across the ballroom, Jasmine Brooks continued helping clear tables. She moved with the same calm professionalism she had displayed all evening. There was no celebration in her expression, no sense of victory. She simply returned to doing her job. Several investors approached her before leaving. Some thanked her for her honesty. Others complimented her insight. A few asked questions about her background. Jasmine answered politely but briefly. She never exaggerated her role in what had happened. She never spoke negatively about Richard. She simply told the truth whenever someone asked. Eventually, the ballroom began to empty. One by one, guests departed. The noise faded. The chandeliers continued glowing above nearly empty tables. Near the end of the evening, Richard finally walked across the room toward Jasmine. Several remaining staff members noticed immediately. So did a handful of investors who had not yet left. Jasmine looked up as he approached. For a moment, neither spoke. Richard seemed to search for the right words. Throughout his career, he had negotiated billion-dollar agreements, addressed shareholders, and spoken before thousands of people. Yet this conversation appeared more difficult than any of those experiences. Finally, he took a breath. "I owe you an apology," he said. The words were simple, honest. There was no audience left to impress, no investors to persuade, just the truth. Jasmine listened quietly. Richard lowered his eyes briefly before continuing. He admitted that he had judged her based on a uniform. He admitted that he had dismissed her without knowing anything about her. Most importantly, he admitted that his arrogance had prevented him from hearing a warning that could have changed the entire evening. Jasmine remained silent for a moment. Then she gave a small nod. "Thank you," she said. There was no anger in her voice, no desire for revenge, only dignity. Richard looked around the nearly empty ballroom. "The worst part is not losing the deal," he admitted. "The worst part is realizing I stopped listening to the right person because I thought I already knew who mattered." The statement hung in the air between them. Jasmine understood exactly what he meant. Many people spent their lives being overlooked, not because they lacked ability, because others never looked beyond appearances. As the final guest departed, Richard extended his hand. Jasmine shook it. The gesture was simple, but everyone who witnessed it understood its meaning. It was not about business. It was about respect. A few minutes later, Richard left the ballroom. Jasmine returned to her work one last time before the end of her shift. Outside, the city continued moving beneath the lights of the skyline. Inside, the lesson remained behind. $3.5 billion had been lost that night. Yet the most valuable thing revealed had nothing to do with money. It was the reminder that intelligence does not wear a specific suit, sit at a particular table, or carry an impressive title. Sometimes it wears an apron. Sometimes it serves coffee. And sometimes the voice people ignore is the very voice they should have heard first.